That feedback is like so painful, but it's so nice to get it when it's not in the form of an Amazon review. It's like, well, I can act on it now. Some small percentage of people who hear about it might buy the book. Some small percentage of those might actually read it. And some percentage of those might actually try it. But for those who do, it works. And then they become recommenders of it.
You sound credible to me. I believe you, Jake.
Okay.
Hey everyone, Devin here, the other partner at Useful Books. This week, Rob and I have the pleasure of speaking with Jake Knapp and learning about his author journey. He's a designer that works primarily in the tech field and has worked on things like Gmail and Google Meet. He's also one of the primary designers at Google Ventures, where he helped develop the design sprint workshop process. And of course, that workshop turned into the super successful book, Sprint. Jake also wrote a second book with his collaborator, John Zaraski, called Make Time. An excellent book around how you can better effectively manage your time during the day to get the things done you want to get done. I'm a huge fan of both of these books. They've had a big influence on me both professionally and personally. It's my extreme pleasure to welcome Jake to this little conversation. How you doing, Jake?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me, you guys, and everyone. Thank you so much for joining.
So obviously I gave you a quick little introduction, but for those who may not be aware of the two major ideas that you put into the world through books, can you give us like a little background on what a design sprint is and where that whole idea came from in the first place?
A design sprint is a way to test a new idea with a team of people. I worked at Microsoft and then I worked at Google. And then at some point I noticed when we're starting a big project, we don't really have it's sort of chaos. It's really hard to get going. And sometimes there are really cool ideas that they just don't ever take off or go anywhere because it can be so difficult to catalyze things in the beginning, to get whoever the decision maker is to commit, to figure out the form, like what should we invest our effort in. You may see an opportunity, but going from that idea of an opportunity to actually beginning to make progress is hard. That very first moment is very hard. And so the design sprint was my attempt to solve that, and starting at Google and almost flailing around a bit, but thinking if they were starting a big project and they were really desperate to get started and I offered to help them, I bet they'd give me up to a week of time. And from that starting point, then over the course of many years, just doing this over and over and over again, first with different teams at Google and then going to Google Ventures and doing it together with my colleagues with a bunch of different startups who we were investing in. We got the chance to practice it and refine the process and finally figure out the sort of 5-day recipe where you start on Monday and you've got an opportunity or a challenge, something you're trying to solve. You've got a team of say 5 to 7 people. You go through all these steps. So by the end of the week, you've created a prototype, a simulation, or maybe even 2 or 3 different ways of solving the problem. And you're putting it in front of your customers. You're watching how they react to it. So in 1 week, you've done this whole cycle of putting something out there and then seeing what it might be like in the future if you fast forwarded and it was already out there in the world, and watching how people react. And along the way, what's cool is when you're designing time, you're designing how people spend their time during the workday, you get to change a lot of the ways that people behave by default, a lot of the things that make it hard to actually get work done, that make it hard to collaborate with each other. And John Zaraski was my colleague at Google Ventures and co-author on Sprint. And some of the learnings from that, we started to apply to our everyday lives when we weren't in design sprints, and trying to find ways to focus more, to make time for those things that are hard to make time for, just in the same way that sometimes the most important project at work doesn't actually get that much focused work time because they're so busy in meetings and doing email. And so the book Make Time is about the way we applied those techniques to our own lives. And so that's the rambly background on those 2 ideas.
One of the things I really want to dive into is this nature of over those years at Google Ventures, while you and John and the team, and I guess Daniel and everybody else were working with the startups directly, starting with probably an amorphous idea of how to run these sprints and then honing it and really building up a robust sort of workshop framework over time. You have done one of the techniques that we mentioned in Write Useful Books a lot, which is using workshopping to really develop a sharp book idea. What was the moment where you're like, you know what? This could be a book, or this has to be a book to get bigger. What was the spark?
When I was a kid, I really wanted to write books. I didn't really picture myself writing business books, but I wanted to write books. That was something that I was really into writing as a kid in high school. I worked on the school newspaper every year, and that was a big part of what I did. But I was also really into computers, since that was going on at the same time, like making games and things like that. I got to college, I took a writing class, and like a creative writing class. And when I started to take writing seriously, I just felt like my writing was not that good. so I'm not going to do that.
I'll just stop.
Yeah, I just, I wasn't able to have the self-confidence to push through not being so good at it. And instead I majored in art, which was something that came more naturally to me. I mean, it was really, of all the things that I might have studied, English, computer science, or business, art was the thing that I was always able to draw. And so I studied that.
Yeah.
I learned some interesting things from doing that that actually made their way into the sprint process. But that notion of writing a book just stopped there. And then 10 years later, I did National NaNoWriMo. I suppose you guys know what that is, but the idea is you write a novel in a month, writing a certain number of words each day. And I thought, I'm going to do this. You know what? I've had kids. I've been reading out loud to my kids for years now. And I thought, what? That'd be fun. I just do that for fun. And I started doing it, and I had so much fun doing it. I didn't succeed in finishing it in a month, but I ended up spending months and months working on this thing over the course of years. And I would make time for it. And this is one of the stories I tell in Make Time, is how I got so into that idea that I wanted to try to start creating space to do that. That gave me so much joy and light. So that interest was always there.
Yeah.
Back in the work world, I start doing design sprints at Google. I go to Google Ventures and do design sprints. At Google Ventures, part of what we were trying to do, because it was this new entity, Google Ventures is one of the Alphabet companies. It's actually technically like a separate company from Google. And although Google's name is well known and stuff, but in the world of startups in particular, like in 2000 and whenever this was, 12, we were quite concerned that people wouldn't want to get an investment from Google, because Google was known for changing their mind about what they were going to, starting new things and then abandoning them. And you don't want that in an investor. And so we needed to build a reputation and explain to people what we were all about. So one thing that became part of my job, I had previously been a product designer. Main thing I'm doing is trying to figure out how the product works, was to tell the story of how we work. And so I started giving talks about it and writing blog posts. And I wrote a series of blog posts about how we did the design sprint. And the idea with those, the intent with those blog posts, was to make me look really smart. So if you're a startup, you'd want to work with us. But what actually happened was people were just like, oh, well, we'll try this recipe. Mm-hmm. And it worked for people. It turns out they didn't need me to be there, which was kind of disappointing, but they were able to run sprints. People just kept reading that sort of how-to guide over and over again, and, sending back stories. And so at that moment, where one of the things we're trying to accomplish is to build the reputation of this new sort of company that we're working on. And then also it's clear that this recipe works for people. And then also it was clear that we had some interesting stories, because we got to go inside these different startups. Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting experience, to be with companies at that moment when they're just getting going. And some of these companies were doing really interesting things. The moment was probably, we sat down and tried to come up with a list of what are the most ambitious things we could do to build the reputation of our business. And I thought, man, I've always wanted to write a book. Maybe there's enough stuff here to write a really cool book.
Do you think the blog post, being put out there as a prototype, seeing the activation, was that one of the things that you weighted in that equation when you're like, you know what, maybe it is worth really trying to codify this?
The blog posts were huge, and people will sometimes come to me and they'll say, I'm thinking about writing and I'm wondering how to get started. And I can only tell people what worked for me. Well, it's just the way we would advise a startup to operate. You need to get something out there and find out if there's product market fit, if there's interest in it. And so certainly if you're writing nonfiction, if you're writing like a how-to thing, it's really helpful to know that there's an audience for it, because publishers aren't good at creating an audience for you. But it's a big investment of your time to write a book, to get it done. So it's nice to have some sense that this stuff works. It strikes a chord with the audience, and there's something there. I don't think that's a requirement before writing a book. And I don't think that if you look at books that are out there and books that you've enjoyed, I'm sure most of them didn't start with a bunch of blog posts or something like that. But for me, that was really helpful, because there was no question in my mind at that point that if you made this book, it would be useful to some people. And then there were a lot of questions about what the form of the book should be, and how to publish it, and how long it should be, and should it have more stories? Should it be more of a how-to guide, whatever. But just that notion that if you make this thing, people will find it valuable. That's a huge deal, because there's the biggest problem with writing a book is self-doubt. And that was a little flame that wouldn't quite go out, was just remembering but people do look at the blog posts.
Yeah. It's the same for me, building products, or even writing a book. When Rob and I wrote the workshop survival guide, it was so much easier to push through, because we knew there were people who were already getting value out of it. And this
Yeah,
was
yeah.
through like us teaching people to do workshops and just doing direct consultancy with them and things like that. It's just a different feeling internally that's like worthwhile producing this extra labor to move to that point.
I'm super curious. These questions, how much stories versus advice? How much entertainment versus pure education? Because obviously pure education is boring. Pure
Yeah.
entertainment is fluff. How do you make these decisions with your books?
That's the thing, right? Like most Malcolm Gladwell books, I love reading his books. And there have been like a couple things where I'm like, oh, that's a really useful thing I could actually use. But for the most part, although I feel like I'm getting all these insights at the time, when it's over, somehow, for me at least, they're empty calories. I don't know what to do with them. You can't make it too dry. You try to make the entertaining parts as entertaining as possible so that you could get away with doing more how-to stuff. And I felt like that's a way to sort of pay people off. I'd give them enough momentum to get them through the how-to stuff, but I felt that having a lot of how-to is really important. I see it as a design problem because, most of my career I'm thinking about designing products and software. And I thought a lot of that, how you format and structure and phrase the things that are the how-to parts is really important. But people aren't going to bother reading the how-to if they don't understand what's important about it, what the story is behind it. So those stories are super important. Those examples are really important. There was a whole team of us. There were 5 of us who worked together at Google Ventures at the time that we wrote the book, and we were all working on it to various degrees, but we were all talking about it. And there was a big debate. I think there was definitely a faction of folks saying this is too much how-to. It's going to be boring. To be frank, I don't know that it landed in the best spot. It has these long sort of prescriptive, if you're the facilitator, here's what you do, here's your recipe. And it feels right to me. There's a book that I read that was my North Star, what this book meant to me, and like the combination of interesting stuff and practical stuff that it had. It's Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. And they have a series of books, and I thought they did a really nice job of making it fairly entertaining, but then drawing this connection between there's some message or key idea in the story, and then they draw it into and here's practically how you might apply it. And those books were both fun and useful to me. And I thought, I want to try to get it to that level. So I don't think I achieved it, but that was helpful, having this picture of that's the gold standard.
I was actually going to ask on that point in Sprint. It's exceptionally well organized for me because I'm a facilitator by trade. A lot of the work I do is teaching workshops. And so I learned a lot from how you guys did it and even adapted some techniques, my own stuff. But obviously looking at the finished copy, it seems obvious this is how it should go together. Obviously you break it into 5 days because it's a 5-day workshop. Obviously you separate facilitator notes from the different workshop formats, from the case studies of people doing it. How did that evolve?
The notion of how it's organized and how it's broken down and explained comes from having to sell the idea. And this is going to come back to something that Rob was talking about in terms of, if I don't have confidence that I've helped one person with this, at least, then I can't write about it. And the other part of helping people in the real world or talking about it in some way before you write the book about it. In the case of the design sprint, I had to sell it, so to speak, to people hundreds of times before contemplating writing the blog post or let alone the book. The very first time I did it, and I have this vivid memory of sitting down with my boss who ran design at all Google and trying to convince her that I should be able to have this. I wanted to create a job for myself doing this thing that I had never done even once. In hindsight, that was stupid, but I had to convince, here's what the design sprint is. Here's the idea of what I have of how it's going to work. And then over and over again, I had to just keep selling it to every team who was going to do it because it was a weird idea. I want you to take a week of time, clear your schedule for a week, and let me basically just boss you minute by minute on what you're going to do during that week. You can't check your email. So I had to sell people on that over and over and over again. And I had to think of different ways to explain it. Talking to a person one-on-one is different than trying to tell a story at a conference when you might have slides, or there are different kinds of people you're selling it to. And so that process of selling it was part of the formation of the process itself, because in order to explain it to people and convince them to do it, it had to be clear what it was. And in order to facilitate the thing and run it for a week and keep people believing that what we're doing makes sense, I had to be able to explain the causal connections between things. And when you write about things, I'm sure all of you have experienced this, my thinking gets clearer about what I'm doing as I write about it and explain it better. And so actually the process itself gets better if I write about the process, because I'm leveling up my thinking. But also that process of explaining it levels up the way you can structure it and frame it and explain it. So it was well worn. I guess basically just every part of it had to be, I felt I had to break it down. I had to draw diagrams on the whiteboard. I had to make slides, have anecdotes already. And so that's, I think, part of why it hangs together as a book was it seemed natural to say like, okay, well, I guess we'd divide it up in that way. I took a week off from work and I said, I'm going to try to follow my own advice and take a week, make a prototype and show it to some people at the end of the week. And the prototype where I spent most of my effort was designing a cover, which looks nothing like the actual cover. And I should be kept far away from cover design, but it was helpful because it made it look to me like a book. And it's actually a really helpful way to imagine like, what is that? How are you representing this? What do you call this thing? And a table of contents for a nonfiction book was super important, thinking about how do you divide it up and what's in each thing? And that's where I think really the structure of the 5 days originally was, that's the way the blog posts were written. And it felt natural to me in doing the table of contents. At first, you write out the table of contents, like, this looks boring. This is not a book I want to read. So it's like, okay, well, we have stories. So then I started thinking, what are the coolest stories that we have or that we might be able to get to put in here? And I started to put those into the table of contents. And I was like, well, this is kind of cool. And then I wrote as best I could, made up a couple pages of one of the stories, and then pasted in stuff from the blog posts and drew some illustrations. And then I made a little like PDF of that. And then I interviewed some folks that I knew who I thought were the target customer.
Mm-hmm. What were those interviews like when you were talking to them at this prototype stage?
In hindsight, I don't think they were done in the right way. If I was trying to be as smart as possible about it, but sometimes I think the reality of doing those kinds of interviews, and I think it's a good thing to do, but we might be doing something that we're going to do anyway, and just trying to give ourselves the confidence to do it. So I showed people who were friends of mine, but I thought had good judgment for one reason or another about whether this would make sense and be useful to a person who wasn't obviously inclined and interested in this topic. I think that's really important, is to have in mind, like for a business book, like a person who's not already totally sold on it. I wanted to convince a kind of somebody who wasn't interested in design, for example.
Yeah.
And I sent the PDF to them, asked them if they'd be willing to take a look at the thing, promised them it'd be like less than 20 pages or something, and mostly drawings and things they could skim. And then I think I sent it to them, and then I think I probably just like had a call with them. It wasn't very smart or sophisticated, but it gave me enough confidence, I guess, to take the next step.
It sounds like you were doing interviews with experts, like people who knew the industry pretty well, which is super valuable. It's like a tremendous shortcut because they have pretty good intuitions about what's going to work and what's not. And often the experts have already spent a lot of time coaching and teaching. So they've got a pretty good mental model often about where amateurs will get confused. I love that. It's part of my process as well, to do these experts who have been in the industry. Often they're a bit battle hardened. They don't feel bad about telling you that you're stupid. And so you can get very unbiased feedback. But then I also love to also counterbalance that with some real amateurs. Like I want my actual readers, and I try to get both. So I see the experts as like the 80% shortcut, but they don't get you to 100%, you know, but I love it. That's how I start as well. It's like the most efficient way you can use your time.
I wish I'd done that with both books, what you're describing. This rings really true to talk. Like, I know that for me, the very best editor and reviewer is my wife, because on the one hand, I'd like to think she has like confidence in my potential. So she believes that this could get good. But on the other hand, as blunt as you can imagine, right? Mm-hmm. You're trying to be funny here. This is just not funny. She will tell me that. And it's not something that's easy for people to say by and large. That feedback is like so painful, but it's so nice to get it when it's not in the form of an Amazon review. It's like, well, I can act on it now.
Can you talk a bit about the marketing?
I think one of the big mistakes that I made was thinking that the audience for Sprint would be convertible to Make Time, to the second book. Mm-hmm. And that wouldn't take like a bunch of work to invest in priming the audience for this topic. It would just sort of be like, if you like to read my newsletter, or listen to my podcast, or read my posts or whatever, now I'm talking about a new thing, wouldn't you like to hear about that too? And the truth is, unfortunately, people are not that into me. They were into the intersection of that topic and me, but once the topic changed, it's like, oh, really? Okay, well, yeah, I don't know. I'm good, you know? And I think that's the thing with Sprint that worked. I think what worked was I had already been talking about it for a long time. I had blogged about it and created a mailing list, and I benefited hugely from the Google name because that book came out and it was associated with how things happen inside Google. And Google doesn't talk much about what they do. So Google corporate sort of stood in my way a little bit, but we were able to get around them and share this process that we're doing. And that was special. I think it also benefited because since then I've been giving talks and teaching workshops about it. And so doing a lot of what politicians do, basically, like trying to convince people one-to-one or in groups of like 20 or 50 or 100, or maybe at a bigger conference is more than that, but that doing my best to convince them that this is an idea worth exploring.
But let me push back on this a bit, because
Yeah.
everyone does a book tour and most of their books still fail.
Yeah.
Your book has succeeded, right? And you're out there, you're hustling, right? You're getting the word out. You're doing both things. But I have to believe that there's something about the book itself, about the way you designed it, about the way you built it, about what it provides to its reader that delivers something.
It has been important to continue to market it because it plants seeds. You plant a new seed that may or may not catch with a new group of people. So you're going to convert some small percentage of people who you talk to actually pick up the book and try it. The reason why Sprint has worked is because the book works for people. So it's a sort of a game of thresholds. It's just readable enough that some percentage of the people who pick it up will read it enough to do it. And it's a pain in the ass to actually do the sprint. So it takes a while probably before they try it. But if they try it, the recipe really does work. So I think what happens is people eventually, some small percentage of people who hear about it might buy the book. Some small percentage of those might actually read it. And some percentage of those might actually try it. But for those who do, it works. And then they become recommenders of it. When we were first working on the book, I managed to track down either through my agent or like friends of friends of friends, whatever, a few authors to ask them about marketing. And Charles Duhigg, who wrote Power of Habit, he's done this like quite well, but he's like, ultimately at the end of the day, books are sold like 1 to 1 to 1. It's just like a recommendation of people. You can strategize all you want, and it's good to do so. And there are smart things to think about, but in the end, it's all about a recommendation. And our editor at Simon & Schuster said, I believe that a good book will find an audience. Like it may take time, but it will find its audience. And part of what I think we've seen play out in a different way with Make Time is that notion of, can it find people and what is the thing that compels them enough to recommend it? And there are different levels of virality of books. But as long as it's above some threshold of like people being willing to pass it on, then it won't be eradicated. It won't go the way of sort of smallpox.
It's a very interesting opinion for a publisher to be like, a good book will find them. Don't worry about it.
Well, this guy was really cool. Like he was very frank about their limitations to do good PR and marketing. Publishers aren't usually honest about that. Buying a book is a big investment for people because not necessarily just because of the cost. I mean, books are not a trivial expense, but the big cost is that you're taking on an unfinished task and you're taking on a thing that sits there. And I have so many partially read books and those are like weight on me, like it's a stressful thing. It's a roulette because the payoff for a book that you really love is super high. So it's great if it works out. I don't know. I love to be able to recommend a book to someone. I feel so smart if I recommend a book to someone and they love it. Recently, I can't remember how it came up, but like I talked my mom into reading The Hunger Games and she read The Hunger Games. Boy, if you can recommend somebody to read The Hunger Games for the first time and then they do it, I felt like I looked like a genius. I felt like I had written The Hunger Games because she was like, wow, this is amazing. And I didn't expect this to be so good. So if you buy a book, there's this high ceiling for how great it could be, but most of the time it's terrible. And that's why personal recommendations are so powerful because you're telling people like, look, like I know you, I read this book. I think it's good. You should read it. And then we'll have something in common. You create this connection between you and your friend or whatever. For a publisher to be able to somehow generate the buzz that's going to make that conversion, it's almost impossible. Podcasts can be powerful. It's very hard to go from being cold on a book to being like, I want to buy that without some personal connection, I think. And I think he was just being frank about that. And because I think the publishing market's quite hard, you may not get like the most sophisticated PR and marketing efforts coming out of publishers. And to the extent that they can do their most sophisticated and effective marketing efforts, it's not going to be for my book. It's going to be for Michelle Obama's book.
Why did you go with the publisher for the second book? What was the decision there?
To be honest, is that self-publishing it is an unknown to me. It's work. You have to figure out how to do that well. When we first started talking about writing Sprint, the first thought was to self-publish it. So then we thought we can make it whatever we want. And then at some point, it seemed like the books that I aspire this book to be like in terms of their effect in the business world are published by major publishers, or at least the ones that I was looking to. And so I think I just followed down this path of there must be a reason why. It seemed like sort of the gold standard to do it that way. And I don't know how well thought through it was. Having done it once through a major publisher and getting some kind of a feel for what worked well and what didn't go so well, I thought, well, the end of the day, there was a whole lot of stuff I didn't have to think about that happened. And the editor at the publisher was incredibly valuable to the quality of the book. So I didn't know how to get access to an editor whose like financial interests were aligned. And he just made our book so much better. And our agent was also good at editing and made the book so much better. And so the structure and the shape of it was informed by them.
So the story of how you guys came up with the cover for Sprint, I think, is, 4 or 5 exceptional designers around the same table trying to do this one thing.
4 or 5 designers who are not graphic designers.
Oh, hey, you
but
have
strong opinions. It's kind of like the worst thing you can imagine. What I've learned is that next time I do a book, I'm hiring somebody to do it who's really good at it. And I should choose among suggestions and proposals that they make. And maybe I can suggest some ideas, which is more along the lines of what happened with Sprint. But I should not do it myself. And Make Time, the plan was to hire Jessica again. And the publisher agreed to that verbally up front and then said, well, let's try to get some concepts there's probably no harm in using our in-house team. Maybe you guys can suggest some ideas to get some concepts so that when we do work with her, we've already got a head start for her. And this made sense to me because the way we got to the Sprint cover in the end was that Jessica had made some different design directions that were like really good, but we were sort of looking for something that was just kind of like magically captured it. And Braden, one of my co-authors, sketched this idea. We're sitting with the publisher and you kind of sketch this idea of what if the letters sort of built in some different way? And then we thought, oh, what if we build them in a progression? And then we sent some crappy version of that to Jessica, who was inspired by it and then created something that was wholly her design. It worked. And the problem with Make Time was that I had some ideas about concepts I thought might work, and I started kind of mock those up. And the designer at the publisher started working on it. And then at some point, the publisher decided, well, we're going to just use what the in-house designer has done. They gave up on the idea of using Jessica. And I can't tell you how much it sucks to be as obsessed with the design as I am and to see that book on your shelf and look at the cover and be like, ugh, like every time like that, it sucks. I don't want to be too involved again. I really want to hire someone who I think is really good, because then I don't have to question the decisions around it. The truth of the matter is that I think a great cover can help a book and a terrible cover can hurt a book. But most books are not in either category, and it's more about what's in the book. Most of the case, cover just needs to be good enough. And if I deluded myself in thinking, well, Make Time's less successful than Sprint because of the cover, that's just not true. There be a variety of reasons for it. But to me, because as a designer, like I am obsessed with that part of things, it's hard. To me, it would be worth it to not have that feeling to pay whatever the designer charged, who I could trust and who I could just take that weight, that question of was it well designed or not, I could just put that on them. It's like, well, they did it. And then it feels totally different. It's like, well, I didn't make that decision. They made it for me. It's like when I'm ordering food at the restaurant and I can't decide, I ask the waiter to decide for me. I'll say, I'm really torn between these two. I would like you to choose which one I should have. And then I don't have any regret because I didn't make the decision. For some reason, I feel a lot better about it. It's just like a glitch in the brain. I don't know. That's what I got.
So there's an increasing trend, which I feel is justified, of aspiring, let's say, bootstrapped entrepreneurs or indie entrepreneurs or people who are trying to plant their flag and build their career. They're like, I need to put out the book, possibly for the income, possibly for the reputation, possibly for, whatever. It kicks the door open. If someone come to you, they say, how do I make this book work? What's your advice to them?
I don't see enough authors and books who are successes and failures to see patterns. And I might be an outlier, I might not, I don't know. But what worked for me was this notion that I already had evidence that the idea in writing form in particular could work for people before I invested the time in writing the book. You're not wrong that there's something really potentially magic and that it can change the way people think about you as an expert on things to write a book. But that's not automatically going to happen. So you really ought to think, because writing a book well is a lot of work. And it doesn't stop when the book's done. You do have to keep promoting it if you want it to spread. I mean, people have different goals for doing it, but I think your goal has to be, in order for it to be successful, I don't think your goal can be, I want to build my reputation. I think your goal has to be, I want to change people's lives. I want to help people do something. If you're talking about a nonfiction book, right, which I think you'd have to be if you're talking about building reputation. So like it won't succeed unless like you're truly motivated to help people with your book, because it's so hard to do that. It's so hard to write something that will actually be useful. If you're not motivated to do that and put in all the hard work to do it, even if you are motivated and you put in all the hard work, it's still hit or miss whether it's going to work. So there's no way you're going to reach that bar if you don't do it. And if you just write a book that's a book for a book's sake, like it might make you look worse. Plus, it's going to be a huge pit of time that you're going to lose years off your life. And a lot of writing is just not fun. They're fun moments, but like a lot of it is just like hell. So I don't know why you do that. What I tell people, the advice is, if you're not sure about whether to do this, see if you can write or share it in some other format. Can you teach it in a workshop? Can you write a post about it? Can you do podcast about it? People can write great books, and the main thing they're doing isn't blogging beforehand, but is there a way to test the idea out and see if it's helpful to people and hone your message? Because the more you do that, you'll have more evidence for yourself that it works. If you do want to find a publisher, you're going to need to show them evidence that you can find an audience for it.
You sound credible to me. I believe you, Jake.
Okay.
Yeah, Jake, thank you so much for spending this time with us. If anyone hasn't read Make Time, this is my copy, which is well thumbed through here. Both that and Sprint are just two of my favorite useful books in like recent memory. The Sprint taught me a lot about how I can even improve my product design process, and Make Time helped me stop wasting time on emails every morning. Is an insane achievement for me, trust me. But yeah, Jake, thank you so much. Do you have any final thoughts or regards, anything you want to shout out to before we wrap up?
I just think that if you guys are writing, if you're like me, it's so hard to do it, and yet I think it's really valuable. I have spent 6 or 7 years writing a fiction book that no one would publish, and yet I still feel great about that project because I don't know, it's a very rich human experience. And so I'm so glad you guys are spending time and thinking about it and would take the time to come here. And so thanks a lot.
Cool. Thank you so much for having me, and see you around. Bye.
See you guys.